Welcome to the Jones Gallery Lecture Series. I'm Sarah Jones, the curator at Jones Gallery. We are a contemporary art gallery in St. John, New Brunswick. Our core mandate is to present work by contemporary Canadian artists, but art education is also important to us, and we think that art history should be accessible, understandable, and free. That's why we hold public lectures at the gallery and produce videos like the one you're watching now. To keep this series free and open, we rely on the donations of our viewers. Today's video is brought to you by Pat, Arnold, Liz, John, and Kelsey. Thank you. If you would like to support our efforts, please donate at jonesgallery.ca/arthistory, and the link will be below in the notes. Up today, I'll be talking about Edgar Degas. As you can see here, this is an early self-portrait of Degas as a young man. And the painting that we'll be discussing is his Carriage at the Races. And I selected this one for our Boston viewer, Michael. I promised to do something from the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And this one is in, not this one, not this self-portrait, but the Carriage at the Races is in the collection of the MFA Boston. And it's a great painting. Great museum. Have I mentioned that I like that museum? Anyway, this is for you, Michael. So just before we get to A Carriage at the Races, I'd like to talk a little bit about Degas and how he fits in with the within the rest of the Impressionists. And the answer is really actually not well. He's always kind of on the periphery, both in terms of kind of the art historical narrative and how we have to deal with him, his technique, but then also he himself, he viewed himself as a bit of an outsider, and he would argue sometimes with the gang at the Café Gerbois. He'd argue with Monet and Renoir, and he saw himself at odds with the group and was hesitant to call himself an impressionist, even though he did exhibit with them. I think he can fit. There are a few distinctions that I think are important to note, but I think overall there are kind of themes and approaches that are it works to put him in with kind of the under the headline of Impressionism. So the first thing that really sets him apart from his fellow Impressionists is that he comes from a wealthy background. He's part of a banking family. They're quite well-to-do, more or less French nobility. He has a very prestigious and rigorous academic background in painting, in art. He studies for a time. He studies the old masters in Italy. And as you can see from this self-portrait, he's not interested in kind of spontaneity and kind of en plein air painting that Monet was scampering about the Normandy coastline doing at this time. But you can see from the self-portrait, like he's very, his compositions are very careful. They're very studied. He has a more realistic approach than an artist like Monet. He's very particular about preparing for his canvas. You can see this, like there would have been a great deal of preparation here, lots of drawing, attention to line and linearity. Very deliberate. This is a very deliberate composition that we're seeing here, a very formal approach, formal technique as well. But what is motivating Degas, and I think it's the motivation really that links him with the rest of the gang, with Monet and Manet and Renoir and Caillebotte and Basile. He has an interest in depicting modernity, so the world around him. So he started off as a history painting or history painter. So part of that kind of very formal education and the interest was in depicting scenes from history or scenes from religion. He started to move away from that and started to paint the world around him. And as you'll see today, he's drawn by scenes of contemporary French leisure. So like today we'll be talking about at the racing grounds, but then also kind of the nightlife around in urban spaces. So, be it at the opera or at the ballet, kind of on the rehearsal stage, in cafes or nightclubs. So he's painting the world around him, and he's applying a modern approach. And what Degas is famous for, and what he does this is remarkable break with tradition here, is in his approach to framing and composition. So I'd like to compare, this is another early work from 1865, with a similar work done a few years earlier by Gustave Courbet, to show you what I mean by framing and cropping and composition. So here we have the flowers, obviously, in the center of the composition. The female figure on the right, she is cut off. Notice how her shoulder is cut off by the frame. Her body kind of exists outside of the frame. Her lower hand is cut off also. And notice her gaze. She's looking out of the frame. And compare that to Courbet's interpretation of a similar scene. Here the female figure turns towards the trellis, and her gaze is at the flowers. And we read this, we're not led to be curious in Courbet's depiction here, or his scene. We're not led to be curious about what is outside the frame. We feel like the scene is complete. But with Degas, and with all of his subsequent work, he always leads us to the question of what is beyond the frame. So here with this figure looking away, and the way that she's cropped, we're made aware of the frame all of a sudden, and the kind of the artificiality of the frame. We want to know what's beyond it. We're aware that this is simply a fragment of a larger piece. And there's always an element of surprise to Degas, that it's always, like I said, kind of strangely cropped. There'll be odd angles, and we're aware of our position as the viewer, that we're perched up on top of something, or we're in behind, or we're sitting somewhere we shouldn't be sitting, or we're looking kind of at an oblique angle. And he's bringing this. It is carefully studied, so this would have been very deliberate, but there's a sense of kind of a truth in it, or a realism, that this is the way the world tends to exist, how we exist in the world, as opposed to being, as opposed to being carefully composed and situated within the frame at all times. So let's turn now to the painting at hand, A Carriage at the Races, in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So we can see here the same type of cropping effect, and I'll talk about that in detail, but I'll let you your eyes sort of move around this and see what you pick up. But we do have a scene. This is a typical scene from the Normandy countryside, of horse racing. You can see the horse race happening, or they're warming up. The horses warm up. Anyway, in the middle ground on the left, there's like a scene of the kind of more or less the racetrack, or the tents and the buildings, and some trees, a bit of a landscape, green landscape, kind of rolling off into the distance. On the left, there is a carriage with a figure, and notice that the carriage has been cropped. So it almost looks like it's kind of teetering there in space. We can't see the left wheel. It's been severed essentially by the edge of the canvas. And then moving to the image in the foreground, or the subject in the foreground, there's a very kind of familial scene, kind of a comforting scene. So there's it's a family. So the father is seated, and he's turning in his seat to gaze down at his child. There's a little dog, little boxer on the seat with him. And there is a wet nurse who is nursing the child. And then the mother in the yellow kind of peering over, and she has a parasol also that's being used to shade herself and the child. Notice also the horses. The horses are cropped off at the knees. The horse on the far right, his nose kind of nudges out of the frame, so we don't have the entire horse. The carriage itself is the bottom wheels are the bottom wheels. The wheels, there are no bottom wheels. The wheels are cut off, also kind of around the middle. And just again, keep this in your mind. We'll come back to this. I'll talk about this work in detail, but just to show you a few examples of an earlier, what I mean by kind of formal or traditional composition and traditional framing. I'll show you two paintings of people on horseback or horses. This is by David, who was beloved of the French establishment and academic painting. You can see how Napoleon's horse, he is not cropped. His knees are there. His nose is in the frame, as is Napoleon. So this is a very obviously contrived composition. Not really true to how we experience the world, with a perfectly rearing horse and gesture and billowing cloak. And you can see how it fits. Once again, we're not interested in what happens beyond the frame because all of the information is contained within it. So we have this sense of completion here. We are very, also we're separate. So there's, we don't have a sense of immediacy, right? That we are separate from Napoleon and his horse. We know that we're not part of this world, the viewer. And I want to show you a contemporary of Degas. This is Messonnier. Once again, Napoleon the First in 1814, completed in 1862. Messonnier gives us the entire horse. You can see he fits very squarely within the composition. Napoleon is dead center. We see all of Napoleon. Nothing has been cropped or oddly, nothing's askew, centered, balanced composition. Compared to this. This is not centered and not balanced. But once again, we're like with the woman with the chrysanthemums, we're made aware suddenly as we our attention, we know that there are bits missing from this, and we know that it's just outside of our vision. It's just outside of the frame of this painting. And so it feels like there's more. It feels like the world then exists beyond this painting. And it feels, to me, much more immediate than the Messonnier, the David that I just showed you. It feels like it's like we're in the carriage opposite, kind of diagonal from the central subject here. And Degas was probably influenced by the development of photography. And so photography was starting to be developed in the mid to late 1800s. And artists were becoming aware of what a scene could look like if you're looking through kind of a viewfinder, right? And that you could move the viewfinder around and include some elements or leave some off. And it's just the nature of the photograph that the scenes could not be perfectly composed, right? You were never going to achieve this or this especially in nature. You could never get a photograph of this, but you could get a photograph of this. So that kind of cropping effect was probably influenced, like I said, by the development of photography. And Degas was a photographer himself. Also, he experimented with photography. So much more true to life and true to how we experience the world. So, like I said, kind of the hallmarks of Degas: unexpected cutting. So that carriage on the left is very typical of Degas and his approach, that something is oddly cropped. There's always asymmetry also. Notice too, if Degas' approach was more conventional, if Degas was following the lead of Meissonier or David, there would be elements that would be more, he would have interfered with more elements, or the more contrived aspects of it. So we have the male figure here in the foreground is carrying that kind of stick to, I'm assuming, to twitch at the horses. That stick is kind of bisecting his body here. And then also notice the umbrella, that there's one point of the umbrella that's almost looks like it's poking into the face of the wet nurse. And it's a little jarring, it's a little odd, but again, it's more true to how we see the world. Just one other little tiny note: the horses in the middle ground that are galloping look like they're flying through the air. Before the invention of photography, artists didn't know how horses looked when they were galloping because their legs were moving too fast. And before, there was a stop motion study done of a galloping horse, and then artists figured out how their legs worked, and that there always was a one leg touching the ground. There's not kind of this leaping kind of gazelle-like flounce to a horse's stride. So this would have been prior to that study, and so you can see that in paintings of horses, galloping horses, from the kind of early to mid bit of the 19th century. If they're galloping, all four legs are kind of springing out into the air. These are just a couple of details I want to show you. This is a very, again, he's showing you what I think is connecting Degas with the rest of the Impressionists, showing us a scene of everyday life, reflecting backward. This isn't Napoleon, so he's rejecting kind of serious historical painting here, and this is just an everyday scene of a family at the races. The little dog. Meissonier wouldn't have painted little dogs. David definitely not. Or the wet nurse. Wouldn't have included the wet nurse. So the subject matter and the approach is what marks Degas as an avant-gardist, as someone who's experimenting, and therefore part of the kind of the Impressionist spirit. And there we are. Let's everyone go to Boston when all this is done, so we can see this little painting. Oh, I should have mentioned that. It's actually quite a small painting. It's maybe 20 inches wide. It's quite tiny, but it packs a punch. So once again, how you can support the lecture series is by contributing at jonesgallery.ca/arthistory. We have lots of other videos you can find. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's just Jones Gallery. I'm Sarah Jones. Technical support today by Caleb Jones, and thank you for watching.